So I'm Nidhi. So my day-to-day job at Micro Focus is to look into a lot of frameworks and applications, mostly in the web application domain, and find new categories of vulnerabilities or what's affecting the vulnerability landscape. And when we are doing that, the goal is always to find that critical vulnerability or look into like how the vulnerabilities that we are writing the checks for or the rules for, how that is actually doing in the actual out in the field. So that means looking at a lot of data that are these vulnerabilities actually found in the applications that we are scanning using our tools. And that led us to do this project of doing the data analysis and on the Fortify data that we have, and as well as the other data, and collect these trends every year, once a year, that we publish in the risk report. And some of the things that I'm talking about here are already published for this year's risk report. So this is like the quick driving direction for this talk. We are going to be talking about breaches because breaches are definitely on everybody's mind. I saw someone was wearing breaches are coming t-shirt. I wish they were coming. They're actually already here, and I wish there was one solution to kill them all, but unfortunately not. And then we'll talk about some of the standards and best practices that normally drives our security practices, right? Followed by some of the vulnerability landscape and the weaknesses that we'll see. So data breaches. Data breaches make headlines. They garner probably everybody's attention. And most of the time when we talk about data, or when we hear about or talk about data breaches, we hear that the data breaches are increasing in size, increasing in frequency. So we set out to see that what exactly the data tells us. And we didn't do this analysis ourselves. It's just too much data. And instead, we found this really well done study that tells something actually different. It sounded pretty radical that the analysis of the models shows neither the size nor the frequency of the data breaches have increased over the past decade. So it's the decade worth of data, not last month, not last year. It's the decade worth of data that they analyzed. And they created these trends. So what specifically that paper said is they found the data breach size is log normally distributed. And the frequency is negative binomial distributed. Like that makes total sense. The first question I asked, what is log normal distribution? And the second was, what is binomial distribution? The curves definitely make sense that the one is decreasing, the second one is also decreasing. That means the data sizes and frequencies must be decreasing. But that's not what they said. They said they just haven't been increasing. If that's what these curves showed, then they would have said they are decreasing, right? So I looked at the graph that they had, another graph that they had in the paper, that 99% of the mortal people actually understand, the graph of averages. The average, over quarterly average, yearly average, and the monthly average over the past decade. And this is the data breaches in size and frequency. What that shows is that the data is truly random. There is a strong random element in the size and the frequency of data breaches. That they are not increasing, but we have been where the graph is showing us we are going. We have been there before. Sometimes the attackers have won. Sometimes the application security programs have won. So if we assume that the data breaches size and the frequency are not increasing, what does that really mean? Do we not have to do anything then? Actually, the way we understand this, the graph and the action item for us, that we have to continue to do at least what we are doing today. And then we have to do some if we want to get the upper hand on the attacker. If we stop doing what we are doing right now, that means the attackers will gain, right? So that led us to look at what are we doing today? Most of the security programs, they are standards and the best practices driven. Am I finding OWASP top 10? Am I meeting the PCI compliance or the NIST compliance, right? And we looked at the bunch of studies on that one too. And this one from Verizon Breach Studies, they published this study that 52.5% of the companies or businesses right now fail to meet PCI DSS compliance, all 12 of them, right? So they are not meeting, they are not able to remediate what we know today about. Then we looked at our own data that we have from Fortify on-demand analysis of the applications. And we mapped it to the OWASP top 10, how many applications currently fail in at least one of these categories of OWASP. And you see every application pretty much, a lot of applications actually fail at least in one or more categories. So they had this vulnerability. Similarly, the GDPR. GDPR is probably on some of your mind, right, that it's coming. What we did, it's not a standard, it's a legislation. So it doesn't tell you like how to secure, like what kind of security you need to have, but it just tells you that you have to protect the privacy of your consumers, right, or the citizens' data. So we divided all the vulnerabilities that can be responsible for the data exposure into 4 different categories, logical categories, and we mapped all of our rules to those. And we saw that all the applications are vulnerable to either one or other. So this is where we stand at the standards and best practices. So even if your program is completely standards and best practices driven, and you remediated every single vulnerability that they detected, you will still be left vulnerable. Why? Because looking at OWASP top 10, it's top 10. It doesn't cover all of the vulnerabilities. So all of we looked at all of the applications that we had scanned. We took the vulnerabilities that OWASP wasn't mapping, that doesn't get included in the OWASP top 10. All the applications, 94% of the application had one or more of those vulnerabilities. Or at least 61% of the applications had one or more critical vulnerabilities. Same with NIST, PCI DSS, or GDPR. If you did the NIST, you'll have fewer of those vulnerabilities, but you will still be probably left with some of the vulnerabilities in your environment. So what does that create? That creates blind spots in our security program. So quickly checking the blind spots, we look into our own code that our developers are writing, right? Our configurations, our tools, our environments, build chain, our people, everything, right? And then in the first presentation, we saw that a lot of vulnerabilities are actually coming from their environment, their components, the third-party components that we are all using, right? So are we looking at all of these or not? But it's very complex to look at everything and checking all the blind spots, aren't they? So what we did is we divided our understanding into 3 things. Are we looking into known knowns? What is known knowns? Known knowns are the vulnerability category types like cross-site scripting, SQL injection that we know about today. That these vulnerabilities exist, and known knowns, the second part of the known, is the vulnerability in the components. Those are your CVEs, right? So you know about those CVEs, and you know what those vulnerabilities are, so you can do something about it. The known unknowns, these are the 0 days of tomorrow, right? You know that there are cross-site scripting, SQL injection, but you don't know whether they exist in your code or not. Either you haven't scanned your code yet, or there are some ways that they are missed. So those are the known knowns. But we have a plan to take care of those, right? To make those known knowns. Unknown unknowns. What we don't know about, we just don't know about. These are the new type of categories that, as security research community, we all have to address, right? We have to continue to look for those unknowns and uncover those vulnerabilities and make them known. So now rest of the presentation, I'll do the little bit of each in each of these categories. not the unknown unknowns, but first is the known knowns. These are the vulnerabilities that we know about, the CVEs. Of course, CVEs are growing, right? We just saw the similar graph in the previous presentation where they showed that the CVEs are exponentially growing. They were growing pretty steadily until 2016. Then they really exploded in 2017. That's when the CNA came in picture. Before that, MITRE was the gatekeeper for assigning the CVE IDs. But just before 2017, they created this, they started authorizing the other organizations and assigning them the block of CVE numbers that they could assign to their products or the researchers who were reporting them. So that's when the count really went up high. So all of those vulnerabilities probably just were waiting to get assigned a number. They didn't get all detected in 2017. But then from 2017 to 2018 also we saw the growth. So there is still like more vulnerabilities that are getting discovered every year. So what's happening there? Why? Why such an increase? A lot of people that we talk to say, oh, it's a bug bounty. Everybody wants to find bugs and get rewarded for them, right? But some of the studies that we looked at, they said bug bounties are only responsible for 4.3% of the total disclosure. So that's a lot of disclosures, and only 4.3 are coming from these kind of initiatives. So what other thing could be happening? One of the things, hypothesis is that it might have led researchers to look at variety of the products, not just focus on one or two or a bunch of products that allowed them to have name, but now there is another reward scheme. So they're just looking at different products. So we looked at the CVs that are getting disclosed. Is there a correlation to the number of products or number of applications they are getting disclosed in? And there was a strong correlation that we found that this graph, it's not the previous graph, it's the new graph showing the number of products that those CVs corresponded to. So it looks very much similar to the previous graph that we had seen. So the number of products are increasing as well. What else? So we have number of products that are increasing. How about the variety of vulnerabilities? Do we still need to just focus on top 10, or there is actually more? So what we found is that when you take the top 20 of the CWEs that those CVEs were assigned to, 15 of those CWEs found their maximum value in the last 2 years. So the variety, so each of the vulnerability has a peak. Like certain year, everybody is focusing on cross-site scripting. Another year, everybody is focusing on unsafe deserialization. So, but in last 2 years, researchers actually focused on a spectrum of vulnerabilities. So the top 10, OWASP top 10 might not just cut it, right? We have to look at every single critical vulnerability that's coming in, critical or different type. Actually, there is another slide for that too. I take that critical back. So this is what I'm talking about. Like if you look at that blue boxes, the highlighted blue boxes, in last 2 years, for like CWE 119, that was like the maximum value was in the 2017, not in the previous years. So every year there would be like just 1 or 2, but in last 2 years there were just multiple. It's exploded. And now why the severity? We found that they are not just focusing on critical vulnerabilities, right? The disclosures are also happening for the medium vulnerabilities. Actually, medium vulnerability disclosures increased to 59%, while the critical ones actually decreased. And it's not actually necessary that the medium disclosures won't lead to an exploitability. For example, like we have the unsafe deserialization, right? It requires actually 2 things to happen. It requires a component to be in your environment, and then a code that's doing the unsafe deserialization. So there needs to be a vehicle that's actually taking, that you are unserializing or deserializing. So, for example, if you had a library in your environment that probably your application is not using, but it just happens to be in the class path, that library, if they have the vulnerability, which is taking the code and executing it, that's what will be needed to exploit that unsafe deserialization. So a lot of people had dismissed the unsafe deserialization in the beginning because there was not that exploitable component in the back. And they assigned the severity medium. But now that it's exploitable, it's been shown, it's found its place in OWASP top 10. Now switching gears to the known unknowns. What do we see in that? This is the graph that we created, or the analysis that we created from the applications that we scanned on Fortify on demand. And what we see, so this is the trend from the last 4 years. No log normal distribution here, just the simple average, what we are seeing. The input validation and representation that everybody is concerned about, right? Whenever you have an injection vulnerability, it gets everybody's attention. So what we saw that in last 4 years, every year consistently, at least 50 to 60% applications are vulnerable to one of those categories. So there is very small increase or decrease, and last year was a really small increase, but that increase was due to path manipulation and server-side request forgery, SSRF. SSRF doesn't make it into top 10, but it was responsible for one of the biggest breach that we saw this year, right? And we saw that in our data, that vulnerability is actually on the rise. The detection, that weakness, sorry, not vulnerability, but the weakness is on the rise, right? So what is happening is more of those kind of constructs or the coding patterns happening across the board in applications, which is likely, right? A lot of people are moving to cloud or using AWS environments. So it is possible that we will see more of SSRF, or whenever you see more of SSRF in your environment, you should pay close attention to that. And then security features always gets me. Security features is the issue type that's related to like your encryption, setting up your SSL configuration. Those are the issues. We consistently see those are the highest amount of issues that applications suffer from. We find the cipher suite selection is not adequate, or they are still using SSL 3.0 or TLS 1.0, right? So those are the kind of vulnerabilities that still show up consistently in applications. And then we created our most critical vulnerable weaknesses. So weak SSL protocol issue was decreased by 7%, and that's probably due to the PCI mandate that created TLS 1.1 is not going to be considered compliant. And also NIST included that in their environment. So all the applications had to move to now TLS 1.2 and above. So we saw some of those. So that's definitely that the standards and best practices definitely drive our security practices. And we have to pay close attention to them. And as I said, that SSR was not one of the top issues, top reason, but it was the reason for major breach this year. And we already talked a lot about the component management, and this is our, again, known knowns, but there are a lot of common misconceptions when we are doing the third-party library analysis, right? So this is very simple example showing how a simple dependency graph might look like, or not the graph, but just the chart. Like if you just listed all the libraries that a program can be dependent on, application can be dependent on, you have one simple code up there for the Apache, but it is dependent on so many different libraries. Some of them are direct dependencies, some of them are indirect dependencies, right? then how do you keep track of all of these vulnerabilities, or the vulnerabilities showing up in each one of these dependencies? Are they all actually reachable? I think that's the biggest question that we have to solve going forward. The reliance on the open source component, that's definitely increasing. Now we see that at least 60% of the applications have 75 to 100% open source component in their environment, in their build environment. And when we look into the vulnerability feed, that CVE feed that you get, what does it mean? So we looked at the top 10 libraries with the CVE disclosure. So like how many, if each library has like 5, 10, 15, we just listed them. Which library had the most CVE disclosure? Which is the most vulnerable library? And we found that in this year's data, that the Microsoft TypeScript, which is now open source, showed up with the most vulnerabilities, like 180 CVEs, while the previous year, it only had 1. Like what happened there? All of a sudden, the full code became vulnerable, or what? So then we looked into, we contacted Microsoft and had the chat with their development environment manager, and they said the response was that most of the insecurities that had been disclosed were in Chakra core DLL, which was not, and the vulnerable code was not reachable by TypeScript's utilization and therefore not directly relevant to TypeScript's security profile. So you have 180 CVEs and you are using Microsoft TypeScript, MS Build and compiler in your environment. But that doesn't make your environment directly vulnerable to those 180, because that itself, the MS Build and compiler itself is not vulnerable to those CVEs. So doing that, being careful about those transitive dependencies is going to be very important. Then another question that we'd like to answer is, in this open source components, what are the vulnerabilities? I hear about the CVEs, but not every CVE is mapped to CWE. And even if it is mapped, sometimes it's just mapped to CWE 20 versus CWE 79. What's the difference? CWE 79 is cross-site scripting. CWE 20 is input injection. Every input injection vulnerability can be mapped to CWE 20. So CWE is by design, it has that flaw that how you are mapping to CWE matters a lot. So if you just took a number of CWEs and saw that, okay, I'm going to see if this product detects more CWE versus this product, it's not going to give you a complete analysis. You have to look at the leaf node that actually representing the true vulnerability. And so all of these CVEs that we found were listed in the libraries that our customers used. What is the most top 10 vulnerabilities that are actually occurring, right? So we looked at their description, we looked at those libraries vendors and their disclosure of those vulnerabilities, and we mapped them to, there is a taxonomy that we have put out, it's called 7PK. That does it's a taxonomy that from the development point of view, like what the developer has to fix. So we found that denial of service was the #1 issue, or the vulnerabilities causing denial of service, which is not truly a security issue, but it's the denying a service, which can become a service if it is a critical security function that that function is providing, or that system is providing, right? Critical security support that's been provided. Then the cross-site scripting, unsafe deserialization, XML external entity injection. So these are the type of vulnerabilities that we saw in our in the libraries that we saw mainly mostly used in our applications, our customers' applications. Then, and all of this data analysis actually we did with partnership with Sonatype. So one of the things that, other thing that we did with their help is look into all of the components that we saw and map that to which component type, what's the component domain that's most vulnerable, right? So we found that most of the components that were vulnerable they fit into application and server management. Then if you have the data processor or the format or the XML type of libraries, those are your second source of most vulnerabilities. Then you have web frameworks and the security functions like your encryption libraries and things like that. Those are probably your third source of vulnerabilities. So maybe addressing the vulnerabilities by those can help you remediate them faster. And now some concluding thoughts. When we see that security feed, do we really see that that's a security issue now, like when we see this knob? Well, someone way, way, way smarter than me said the context matter. When you have the whole thing vulnerable, what you're going to do? You have to look at the big picture, that fixing a knob wouldn't fix it. So just the concluding thoughts, that understand the threat model in your applications, and prioritize based on your highest threat, severity, visibility, the good things that Aladdin talked about, and address the known knowns first, then address the known unknowns as well, and always be lookout for the next unknown unknown. So if you hear about the new type of vulnerabilities, new categories of vulnerability, definitely pay attention to and see if you can detect them, like if your applications are vulnerable to them. And with that, I'll take if you guys have any questions.